Oh, classes, this is lecture number 20 for History 102. And last lecture, we were talking about life in the 1920s, and we want to wrap that up today by talking about something that dominated the entire decade. That's Prohibition. Now, Prohibition was created by the 18th Amendment that was ratified in 1919, which gave Congress the power to make the consumption, distribution, manufacture of alcoholic beverages illegal. Now, the law that they passed that made that illegal was known as the Volstead Act, which they passed after they got the authority in 1919 with the 18th Amendment. Now, we talked about how Prohibition came into being when we were talking about the progressives. So I want to remind you of a couple things and also explain to you how I suppose this, why this was destined for failure right from the beginning when it's instituted in 1919. First of all, by that point in history, it was a state-by-state, county-by-county issue where whole states could pass laws prohibiting alcohol within their state boundaries, and they became known as quote-unquote dry states, or it could go county by county like it did in New York State. Some counties outlawed alcohol while others didn't, and they were known as dry counties. And this was the case all across the United States. And by the time 1919 rolls around, 50% of Americans were living in either dry counties or dry states. The other half of Americans were not. And quite frankly, that system worked. And that's probably how they should have left it. That way, it was your choice. If alcohol was something you wanted in your life, you moved to a quote-unquote wet state or wet county. If alcohol was something you didn't want in your life or be near to, then you lived in a dry state or county. But the choice was yours. Now, when they passed the Volstead Act, all of a sudden, boom, one day, something that's perfectly legal in half of America becomes illegal in half of America. That's a formula for disaster because so many Americans were accustomed to doing what they wanted to do. Now, another group that's going to be in opposition to this are World War I veterans. Now, they'll return from the war over in Europe by ship, slowly but surely, the same year Prohibition will go into effect. And it will be in effect before they arrive back. Now, they'll feel like they were completely left out of the decision-making process. That they went off to war in 1917, victoriously won the war for the world. They returned in 1919, and now alcohol's illegal in their country. And when they left, it was legal in more than half of the country. So they felt like they pulled a fast one while they were gone. Not that all World War I veterans were, big drinkers or something. They just resented the fact that they were not part of the process, or that's how it appeared to them. So they're going to be a big group that is against it also. So Prohibition's going to be a complete nightmare. And all it's really going to do is create people that we call back then gangsters And then ultimately, they'll evolve into organized crime. That's the only lasting thing that will come out of this experiment with prohibition in the 1920s. Now, that's because bootlegging becomes very prevalent. People either manufacturing their own alcoholic beverages illegally, or as the case right up here in the North Country, smuggling illegal alcohol in from Canada. Because another big mistake here, or underlying factor that caused its failure, prohibition being what I'm talking about, was the fact Canada didn't have prohibition. And we have an awful long border with Canada. So people would routinely go up to Canada, get truckloads of liquor, and smuggle it back down. Now remember, this is the 1920s. A lot of rural border areas in the United States were not guarded at all. And it was sort of an open border. It was that way all the way up until 9/11. That's when we really cracked down on the border. Before that, there was parts right up here in the North Country where you could cross the border and nobody'd know. And back in the 20s, boy, were they. And they'd smuggle booze, stash it in a farmer's barn up here in the North Country, lay low for a couple days, pay off that farmer, and then basically they drove it down to New York City, where alcohol was very prevalent in the city. Now, probably many of you have heard stories from your grandparents or great-grandparents about bootlegging activities that took place up here. And one place where it was certainly prevalent, also right here in the North Country, is where you go to college. That used to be the Hotel Champlain. And if you look back at the old menus from the 20s, alcoholic beverages were on the menu. And Hotel Champlain kind of set up by itself on the hill, and it was a place where the more wealthy could go and live in a world where prohibition didn't exist. So, this is a big disaster. All it does is create gangsters. And the city where gangsters are most prevalent, and it becomes the most violent city in America, is Chicago, by far. In the 1920s, more than 500 people lose their lives in gangland warfare between different gangs fighting over territory where they thought it was exclusively theirs to sell the bootleg booze. And the most famous of these gangsters, there's a photograph of him on page 718 in your book, Scarface himself, the famous Al Capone. And there he is in all his glory, fishing on his yacht in Florida in his pajamas and robe, smoking a cigar. I guess when you're Al Capone, you can do any damn thing you want to, and he obviously did. Now, Al Capone is going to be the biggest gangster in Chicago and make millions off it. And he's always one step ahead of the federal government. They can never catch him. Ultimately, Al Capone will end up in a federal prison because they get him on tax evasion. Here he is, this millionaire with yachts and homes in Florida and Chicago and limousines, but he never filed any income tax. So the federal government got him for tax evasion. Obviously, he's not going to file income tax because what's he going to put as a source of his income? Bootlegging? But it's kind of a catch-22. You don't, then you're a tax evader. The federal government uses this same ploy to throw a lot of drug dealers in prison today. So, the most famous event that occurred in Chicago as far as violence goes happens in 1929 on St. Valentine's Day, the infamous St. Valentine's Day Massacre in the city of Chicago, where a rival gang will burst into a restaurant where The other gang is out to dinner for Valentine's Day, and 7 gang members will be mowed down with machine guns in this horrible, violent act. It'll kind of be the crowning event for violence during Prohibition in the 20s. Now, it's estimated that during the decade of the 1920s, gangsters or organized crime profited to the tune of at least $12 billion, possibly up to $18 billion. That's as much as the federal government spent during the entire decade. So their profits rivaled that of government spending. Now, as we'll find out, when the Depression hits, and then ultimately when Franklin Roosevelt is elected in 1932, one of the first things he'll do is get the 18th Amendment repealed. And we'll cover that when we get to FDR and the New Deal. So, now we want to move it more into the politics of the 1920s, since we've covered all the social aspects. And obviously, we already covered the election of 1920, and we know the outcome. Warren G. Harding wins the election. So in March of 1921, he takes over. We already talked about how he pardoned Eugene Debs. He is a sort of a hands-off president. And unfortunately, he's not a very good judge of character. In some instances, he's pretty similar to President Grant. And he's going to surround himself with people he thinks he can trust from his home state of Ohio, and many of them end up to be crooks. And in fact, his appointees from Ohio will be even referred to as the Ohio Gang. So, the first thing, though, that we want to talk about before we get to any corrupt activities by the Harding administration is in 1922, since now big business Republicans are back in control of the government following all those progressive administrations of Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson, they're going to pick up where they left off, and they're going to jack up the tariff once again. Now remember, President Wilson, when he attacked the Triple Wall of Privilege and got the Underwood Tariff Act passed, was the first significant decrease in decades. Soon as big business Republicans are in control, and especially under the leadership of the Secretary of the Treasury, Andrew Mellon, who is an aluminum tycoon, they're going to jack back up the tariffs. And they're going to raise them to an unprecedented level of averaging nearly 40%. And the name of this law is the Fordney-McCumber Tariff Law, passed in 1922. Besides raising the tariff, the way that they sold this to the American public, which was basically a bill of goods, they said that the president could single-handedly increase or lower tariffs, and that this would give him an opportunity to negotiate lower tariffs with other countries, and that the end result would be much lower tariffs worldwide. Well, that was a bunch of baloney. In the 6 years that this bill existed, with the president being able to either single-handedly increase or lower tariffs with individual nations based on negotiations, there were only 5 actual reductions in tariffs. In stark contrast, there were 32 increases. So overall, they're jacking the tariff back up to an average of about 40%. As we'll find out, this is going to be one of the major causes of the Great Depression. It'll come back to haunt us. Now, the next thing that Secretary of the Treasury Andrew Mellon, the aluminum tycoon, goes after is income taxes, which had increased dramatically during World War I to pay for the war effort up front. So he will get Congress to significantly lower taxes because during the war, that highest tax rate for a handful of very wealthy Americans had skyrocketed up from 2% to 20%. So he's going to push through this new tax legislation, which will drastically lower income taxes, and it will certainly lower it on the wealthy. And even though, excuse me, to give you an idea of what taxes were still about, most Americans didn't make enough money to pay any income taxes still. And in fact, at its height, before Mellon passed this new tax legislation, only 6.5 million Americans made enough money where they were paying income taxes. And remember, our population's about 125 million people. After Mellon gets done with it, he'll lower the number of people paying income taxes from 6.5 million down to 4 million. And to give an example of how this benefited his wealthy pals, after Mellon's done with the tax reforms, the richest man in the world, J.P. Morgan, pays 0 in income taxes. How in the world that could be possible, only Andrew Mellon knows. So, the next thing we want to start talking about is outright corruption. Now, raising the tariff and lowering the income taxes, they weren't examples of corruption. They may have been unethical, creating a system where J.P. Morgan does not pay any income taxes, but it's not outright blatant corruption. The biggest corrupt scandal that'll really rack the Harding administration is the Teapot Dome scandal. Now, before I get into the details of that, I want to mention something that I forgot to tell you about the Harding administration. He will have some honest people in his administration, including his Secretary of State, Charles Hughes, the famous former presidential candidate, former Supreme Court Justice and champion of civil rights. And another very wise move upon Harding's part is there'll be several openings on the Supreme Court that come up. And he'll fill one of those openings with our old buddy, former President William Howard Taft. So Taft will finally get to fulfill his lifelong dream and become a Supreme Court justice, which he really should have done in 1906 when Theodore Roosevelt offered him the position then. But at least he finally gets to do it, and he'll serve on the court for quite some time. And obviously, he's highly qualified. So now, back to corruption. The biggest scandal that'll rack the Harding administration, and it happens in 1923, will be the Teapot Dome scandal. Now, here's what Teapot Dome is all about. Here's the background information to it. A couple of really gigantic oil deposits were discovered on federal land. And one of them is known as Teapot Dome. The other one was located in California, and it's not the subject of this corrupt activity. Now, Teapot Dome is in the state of Wyoming. And part of the reason why they call it that is it's this gigantic natural deposit of oil that is directly underneath a very big granite dome. That's a natural formation. And it's on federal land, so all Americans own it. So, this is discovered, and it creates a big debate on what should we do with it. Finally, Congress is wise enough to say, let's leave it right where it is. We know approximately how many millions and millions of barrels of oil are down there. They're not going anywhere, and they're encased in granite. So they're protected. So it's like nature's giant oil reserve. So let's just leave it there, and if we need it in the future for emergency situations like a war to tap it for military purposes or whatnot, it's not going anywhere. So that's what they decide to do. So officially, Congress deems it a naval oil reserve because the Navy back in this day and age was the largest consumer of oil in our military. So officially, it's under the Secretary of Navy's control, Admiral Danby. But this is where one of the Ohio gang comes into play, and that's the Secretary of the Interior, Albert Fall. Now, technically speaking, all federal land falls under the Department of the Interior Department and under control of the Secretary of the Interior. So, Secretary of Interior Fall gets a hold of Secretary of Navy Danby and says, hey, do you want me to manage Teapot Dome for you? And the Secretary of the Navy says, I don't care. You know, it's just going to sit there until we need it someday. So, yeah, go ahead. That reason why the Fall is so interested in this, he's in cahoots with two oil tycoons. Their names are Harry Sinclair and Ed Doheny. They own Sinclair Oil Company, which is a major oil company of the day. And I can remember they still existed when I was a kid. There was a Sinclair Oil gas station just down the street from my house, and their trademark symbol was a big green dinosaur. Now, Sinclair and Doheny approach Fall, and as we'll find out later on, they end up paying him $400,000 in bribes for him to illegally issue them a drilling permit to go in, drill for oil at Teapot Dome, and drain the reserve. So, this will all be uncovered by mistake by some hunters out in Wyoming. They were all hunting in the Teapot Dome region, heard all this racket, went and investigated, saw these oil derricks and so forth, and reported it because they knew what Teapot Dome was, and they're wondering why in the world are they drilling into this oil reserve. So that leads to investigation, which ultimately leads to a court trial where Albert Fall, Harry Sinclair, and Ed Doheny are all put on trial. Now, as this trial unfolds, both Sinclair and Doheny take the Fifth Amendment and refuse to testify against themselves. Now, Albert Fall will take all the blame. And obviously, there's not much he can do. They've got this document. It's an oil mineral rights drilling permit issued to Sinclair and Doheny by Secretary of Interior Albert Fall. They've got the goods on Fall. So Fall ends up pleading guilty. He's going to end up getting a 1-year prison sentence. And both Sinclair and Doheny will be acquitted. Now, Later on, it'll be discovered when Fall writes his memoirs that he had been paid $400,000 in bribes. Now, $400,000 in 1923 is the equivalent of about $6 million. Now, so essentially what ends up happening here, Fall had that money hidden. No one knew about it because Sinclair and Doheny aren't testifying. Fall just pleads guilty. He ends up spending a year in prison. He's disgraced. He's out of the, obviously, Interior Department. But when he comes out, he's got $400,000 stashed that nobody knows about. Now, let me ask you. Would you be willing to spend a year in jail for about $6 million? At least you'd think about it, wouldn't you? So, that's what happens in the Teapot Dome scandal. It's very damaging to President Harding, but Harding basically, just as, kind of like President Grant, I had no idea this was going on. I'm shocked by the behavior of my Secretary of Interior, Albert Fall, and there was no evidence pointing to Harding having any sort of influence or partaking in this scandal at all. So, that's where we'll end this particular lecture. We'll pick up in a few minutes after I take a break and get a drink of water here. And we'll talk about some more corruptness that takes place in the Harding administration. I'll be talking to you soon, class.